of announcements for folks. So we have interpreters who should be visible for folks. If you're having any issues with that, please send Harper a message, and Harper will be providing some technical assistance on the back end. Or you can put a message in the chat as well, or the Q&A if you're having any issues, but they should be visible. And we also have captions. So you should be able to enable those. But if you have any technical issues, please send Harper a message. And it is my pleasure. My name is Julia Endicott. I'm the Communications Director here at Disability Rights Maine. My pleasure to introduce our speakers for this evening, Kim Moody and Michelle Ames. And Kim, I will hand it over to you to kick us off.
All right, since it's 5:05, we'll get going immediately. I first want to just say thank you to all of you wicked cool people who care about disability rights, both nationally and in Maine. It is my honor to speak with you about the movement that has defined my life, really. That's the disability rights movement. This is a story of fierce activism, courageous resistance, and the unyielding demand for dignity and justice. This isn't just a story of policy changes or court decisions. It's a story of people who dare to demand access, education, employment, and the right to live fully on our own terms. It really is truly about fighting oppression. The disability civil rights movement is often left out of our textbooks, but to my way of thinking, its legacy is easily as profound as any other liberation struggle in American history. Of course, there are many ways to tell this story, but I always begin with Ed Roberts, the father of the independent living movement. At age 14, Ed contracted polio and became paralyzed from the neck down. He needed a respirator to breathe, and he spent most of his youth, or much of his early youth, in hospitals. He applied to the University of California at Berkeley in 1962, and they didn't know what to do. One official actually said, "Oh, we've tried cripples before, and it just didn't work." But Ed persisted, and he won. And then he and other disabled students formed the Rolling Quads, advocating for ramps and curb cuts and personal assistance while being educated. But more importantly, they were the first to really loudly and proudly challenge society's view of disability. And they sparked a revolution. The belief that disabled people should run our own lives, make our own decisions, and participate fully in our communities. Imagine that. But it had been unheard of. We had lived in institutions or hospitals or back alleys or back rooms for hundreds of years. In 1972, Ed helped establish the first Center for Independent Living in Berkeley. It was controlled by and for people with disabilities. It rejected the medical model that saw disabled people as problems to be fixed. Instead, it embraced a social model that said the real barriers are society, society's architecture, society's prejudices, and society's policies. It quickly became a model replicated across the US and even around the world, the model of self-determination. At the same time, thousands of disabled people, especially those with developmental or psychiatric labels, were being warehoused in often horrific institutions. In 1972, journalist Geraldo Rivera exposed horrific conditions at Willowbrook State Hospital, State School. It was an institution on Staten Island. His televised report showed children living in filth, neglected, abused, and warehoused. Fortunately, the public outcry was massive, and it led to a turning point. In response, Congress created US, the Protection and Advocacy System, in 1975. Publicly funded independent agencies with the power to monitor institutions, investigate abuse, and advocate for the rights of disabled individuals, a real first. This system became a powerful tool for challenging abuse, promoting deinstitutionalization, and enforcing disability rights. These agencies in every state across the nation became lifelines for people with no other protections, people with no power or voice, people trapped in institutions. We played a key role in advancing civil rights. And as the independent living movement and the P&A systems expanded, a broader national disability rights movement emerged, led by figures like Judy Heumann, Justin Dart, and ADAPT. Judy Heumann had already successfully sued the New York Board of Education for denying her a teaching license because of her wheelchair use. She won. In 1977, she led what would become one of the most important actions in our history, in disability rights history, the 504 sit-in. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was supposed to prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability in any federally funded programs. But for 4 years, the government simply refused to implement it, refused to make it regulation. So Judy and over 100 other disabled activists occupied the San Francisco Federal Building. They stayed for 28 days. They had no beds. They had very little food, and they were really risking their own health. But they won. The regulations were signed. It worked. This sit-in, the 504 sit-in, became a defining moment in our history, proving that disabled people could organize and win lasting change. And it remains the longest nonviolent occupation of a federal building in U.S. history. Judy went on to serve in multiple administrations, and she helped craft the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And she never lost her fire. Meanwhile, Justin Dart, a charismatic cowboy-hatted, also polio survivor, and former Reagan appointee, brought national attention to the need for federal disability rights legislation. After being pushed out of federal government for refusing to stay silent, Justin and his wife Yoshiko started traveling in 1981, and they went to every state and every territory, gathering testimony from thousands of us. Justin and Yoshiko amplified our voices with one single message: I love you, lead on. And at the same time, ADAPT was staging protests across the country, blocking buses and demanding accessible public transit. Founded by Bob Kafka and others in 1984, ADAPT was fierce, grassroots, and effective. ADAPT members literally threw their bodies in front of buses, jumping out of their wheelchairs to demand lifts and access. They chained themselves whenever necessary, and they were arrested in great numbers. Then came the next really defining moment for all of us, and that was the fight for the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. In July of 1990, after years and years of organizing, lobbying, marching, begging, activists staged the Capitol crawl. Dozens of disabled people, including children, left their wheelchairs and crawled up the steps of the US Capitol to show the barriers that they faced every single day. Tom Olin took pictures of it all. Seek them out if you've not seen them. Tom Olin. On July 26, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed the ADA into law. This was our civil rights bill, prohibiting discrimination in employment, public accommodations, transportation, and more. It was the culmination of decades of activism. When President Bush signed the law, he said, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." Parallel to the independent living movement and the physical disabilities movement was the psychiatric survivor movement, a movement often overlooked in the disability history, but just as important, obviously. The psychiatric survivor movement was led by people with experience of forced treatment, confinement against their will, coercion, and psychiatric oppression. One of the earliest leaders was Judy Chamberlain, who had been involuntarily institutionalized in the 1960s after experiencing depression. She quickly realized that her diagnosis had stripped her of basic rights. She described psychiatric institutions as places of coercion and control rather than healing. She called it psychiatric incarceration. After her release, Judy wrote On Our Own, a book that challenged traditional psychiatry and called for peer-run alternatives to hospitalization. She was a pioneer. She became a leading voice in what was then called the mental patients liberation movement. Judy then helped found the National Empowerment Center in Boston and the National Association for Rights Protection and Advocacy, a national organization that is still very much around and very powerful. Judy's central message was simple but radical. People labeled with psychiatric disabilities have the right to control their own lives and define their own recovery. We are still not there. David Oakes founded Mind Freedom International, which was a global organization of psychiatric survivors and allies. David often said, "Normality is killing us all," pointing out how society defines mental illness in ways that uphold systems of oppression and conformity. David's mantra: normalize love, unleash activism. Mind Freedom was instrumental in protesting forced drugging, electroshock therapy, the medical model of mental illness, and the institutional abuse of people with psychiatric disabilities. Howie the Harp, a formerly homeless psychiatric survivor, musician, and fierce advocate, championed peer support and helped create the first peer-run crisis alternatives and employment training programs. Today, the Howie the Harp Advocacy Center continues on. Ray Unziger, another leading survivor, rose to national prominence and was appointed by President Clinton to the National Council on Disability, which had formerly been populated mostly by people with physical disabilities. Ray spoke powerfully and passionately against forced treatment and for real person-centered recovery. Activists protested electroconvulsive therapy and other forced treatment, with leaders like Gail Bluebird, a Lakota psychiatric survivor, nurse, and poet, emphasizing cultural healing and peer leadership in Native and survivor communities. In 1990, survivors organized the counter conference to the American Psychiatric Association in New York. It was a big deal. Hundreds gathered to protest coercion, to march in peace, and to offer workshops rooted in empowerment and choice. This action drew national attention and symbolized the growing power of this movement. To me, it was akin to the 504 sit-in. Of course, there were many, many, many more leaders in these parallel movements, but this is my telling. And I met or knew well each of those people that I have named. While these leaders were fighting to change the world, thousands of others of us were organizing across the country and around the world. From its earliest days, the disability rights movement was shaped by many voices, but almost always back then, the contributions of disabled people of color, LGBTQ+ people, and especially Black, Indigenous, queer, and trans disabled leaders were overlooked or even erased. That's why the disability justice movement emerged, not to replace disability rights, but to expand it. It was created in 2005 by a visionary group of disabled queer people of color, including Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, Leroy Moore, Stacy Milburn, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret. Together, they named what had long been missing from our movement, a movement that centers those most impacted by systemic oppression. They continue to center collective liberation, a critique of capitalism and white supremacy, and they uplift queer, trans, and BIPOC disabled voices. Also, disabled women like Corbett O'Toole and Laura Hershey called out sexism and ableism in our movement. And disabled people of color like Brad Lomax, a Black Panther with MS, who helped organize the 504 sit-in, started calling out the racism inherent in our movement. There are many more movement leaders you should know. And when I started doing a PowerPoint presentation, I listed them. But I'm happy to send this that I've written to any and all of you. But Bob Williams, Marka Bristow, Johnny Lacey, Lydia Brown, there's so many that came before us and shaped this movement that has changed all of our lives. So to Maine has been a leader in many ways. These things are not necessarily in order at all, but eliminating sheltered workshops that paid sub-minimum wage, Maine became a work-first state. It was supposed to ensure that people with disabilities have access to real jobs at real wages. But we did. We eliminated sheltered workshops. Very impressive. I gotta say next, though, in this most recent legislative session, the Maine legislature passed and the governor signed into law a law banning the use of planned restraint for people with developmental disabilities, ending decades of government-sanctioned abuse. Just the coolest thing. Then there's us, Disability Rights Maine, Maine's protection and advocacy agency. We have been at the forefront of advocating for inclusive education, deinstitutionalization, and access to our communities since 1977. Uniquely and luckily, the state of Maine provides direct state funding to DRM. They expand advocacy for people with developmental disabilities and psychiatric labels. This is truly innovative, empowering more proactive and robust advocacy by the P&A. Of course, in Maine, we closed Pineland Institute in 1996. Those kinds of institutions still exist all over the country. Maine has led on guardianship reform and was an early adopter of supported decision-making. Maine's psychiatric survivor movement helped shape mental health policy through peer support and the Consumer Counsel System of Maine. The Maine Human Rights Act, our civil rights statute, was enacted over 40 years ago in 1971, but disability was not included. Shortly after, though, in 1974, the legislature amended the act and made it clear the right to freedom from discrimination on account of disability in employment, in housing, and in access to places of public accommodation became a civil right in Maine. Maine became unique. People were talking about it. In 1974, there were very few states that prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability. And that was almost 20 years before we passed the ADA. At that time, reasonable accommodation was barely a concept. and buildings were universally constructed with steps, heavy doors, and really tiny bathrooms. In 1975, the DD Act was passed, and we opened our doors in 1977. So for almost 15 years before the ADA, Disability Rights Maine, which was first called the Advocates for the Developmentally Disabled, which at that time was pretty cool and forward thinking because everybody else was using the R word. But anyway, we, ADD, were working with Alpha One and the Maine Association of Handicapped Persons to file complaints and to find groups of people for whom to file complaints in order to create systemic change. The very first Human Rights Commission case in the area of disability dealt with an employment decision. A person had been hired, but during a conversation with the employer found out that he had a previous back injury and fired him on the spot. They did no medical review, and there were no medical restrictions that prevented him from doing this job. The commission found that unlawful discrimination had occurred. So more and more people came forward and filed complaints with the commission. As the commission began deciding cases, though, those decisions were met with resistance. And in 1982, legislation was introduced to change the act. The bill included language that said, the present law may prevent an employer from screening out classes of individuals whose handicaps render them particularly unsuitable, and you get the rest. So that was the year, I think the first year in Maine, when disability groups came together in a powerful coalition. Disability had a voice and faces and names and stories. Policymakers were kind of forced to think about people with disabilities as actual people, as individuals with abilities, rather than as a class, the handicapped. The sponsor of that bill actually announced publicly that she would vote against it, her own bill, and the bill was defeated. This is powerful stuff back then. The following year, the law court first decided a case interpreting disability provisions of the Maine Human Rights Act. First case. Many of you probably know it. Maine Human Rights Commission versus Canadian Pacific. The decision contained a strong statement of the public policy advanced by the Maine Human Rights Act, that every person has the civil right to secure employment without discrimination based on disability. Of course, the decision said handicap. That was a huge win. While Canadian Pacific was being decided, the Maine Association of Handicapped Persons was fighting for accessible buses. Later to become a congressman from Maine, Tom Andrews was then the association's executive director. Kathy McGuinness, who many of you met when we unveiled our painting of her in Capitol Park during a very early disability pride, was their board president. Back then, municipalities could purchase a bus for a metro system for $78,500, but it cost another $1,000 to make that bus accessible. So the city of South Portland had decided that it would purchase 6 inaccessible buses and have persons who needed access make arrangements for themselves to ride on a separate regional transportation system. Project Access was launched by the Maine Association of Handicapped Persons, and they filed a complaint with the Maine Human Rights Commission. The commission found unlawful discrimination and filed suit. The law court ruled in this case that access to public transportation for people with disabilities was a civil right, and transportation services needed to be accessible and integrated. So, by the mid-1980s, Maine's highest court had declared that the ability to secure employment and to have access to public accommodation without discrimination on account of disability were civil rights. 2 huge decisions for all of us. Later in the 80s, everybody's attention turned to buildings. In 1987, I started at DRM. I had tried to work for the Maine Association of Handicapped Persons in 1984 when I graduated from college, but they had no money. So I just volunteered with Tom and Kathy and began work for Mary Herman as a lobbyist in Augusta. I sat in the back of appropriations with Dean Crocker, the first and still then executive director of the Advocates for the Developmentally Disabled. I interviewed with us, with ADD, in 1985, but they didn't hire me. In 1987, they actually called me back, though, and offered me a job without an interview. Also in 1987, Alpha One took on a project in Portland, in the whole Portland area, to educate building owners about access requirements and to encourage building owners to correct violations and impediments. Alpha One staff noted problems, wrote letters to owners about the violations, and offered their assistance. But most attempts to correct situations were ignored. So Alpha One filed complaints with the commission, 65 complaints to be exact, about access violations over a 6-month period. It was huge and so exciting. And then over 500 more complaints were filed by individuals and organizations over the next 8 years. So the conversation began to turn towards systemic change, which eventually led to Maine becoming the first state in the nation to require mandatory plan review for accessibility compliance by the state fire marshal's office. They had to review every plan. Of course, we at DRM were at the forefront of those efforts, chairing that committee. There's so much, but in 1989, Helen Bailey and DRM filed a class action lawsuit against the state. 6 people died at Augusta Mental Health Institute the summer before. Choking, drowning, and heat stroke were among the causes of death. Then executive director of what we became Maine Advocacy Services by then, forbid Helen to file suit. And Helen said she'd quit and take the case with her. A bunch of us would have gone with her. So we all know what happened. Then the ADA passed in 1992, and we could all finally say, see, disability rights are civil rights. But in the meantime, what's missing here? We got some physical access. We could get into some buildings and some programs and onto a few trains and buses. We could hope for success in lawsuits when we were fired because of our disability. We had PL 94142, which meant that we could at least fight to get kids with disabilities into classrooms. The Rehab Act had passed. 504 was signed. The Maine Human Rights Act included disability. We had come a really long way. But what's missing is that while all that cool stuff was happening, our institution for people with labels of disability were full. Hundreds and hundreds of people who were institutionalized against their will and had been there for their lifetimes or for many, many years, and who had had their will and their agency stripped from them in sometimes sick and inhumane ways in order to continue to fund the disability industrial complex. And that really is what we, DRM, was really created to address. We were supposed to improve conditions in institutions. Nobody was talking about closing them at that time. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities were and are around the rest of the country. But here even, still, well, back then, we're still institutionalized in horrid conditions, and they are still across the rest of the country. And people with labels of mental illness too. People who have experienced trauma that causes extreme states, instead of being helped to heal and recover, are still put away, locked up, out of sight, out of mind. Maine has its own long history of disability oppression and disability rights, and it's still unfolding. But Maine is most definitely a leader in this movement. And I am proud to be a Mainer, and I am proud to still be part of this movement. This movement has always been about freedom and about justice for all. People with disabilities took the radical step of saying, we belong here and we shall not be erased. Ours is the history of resistance. It's the story of people who crawled up Capitol steps, who refused medication, who demanded education, who fought for the opportunity to have real jobs, who pushed back and demanded access, and who organized across race, gender, and disability lines. And this is about all of us, building a world where interdependence is valued, access is expected, and no one is left behind. This means fighting not just for ramps and laws, but also for Black disabled lives, for trans disabled youth who are under attack, for immigrant disabled people navigating inaccessible systems, and for every single disabled person whose body or identity is used as an excuse for exclusion. And so we honor not just the names we know, but the millions of disabled who are in this fight. As Justin Dart said, get into politics as if your life depends on it, because it does. Let us honor the past, not just with memory, but with movement. Nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was amazing. And I know we have a couple of questions. I think we'll save them till after our next presenter. So folks, please do feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. And after Michelle presents, we will spend a few minutes on Q&A. So my pleasure to now pass the floor over to Michelle Ames, DRM Deaf Services Program Director.
Thank you so much, Julia. And that was an incredibly powerful just survey and historical perspective on our fight and our rights. And I just want to say 100%. What a great presentation. I'm going to focus on the civil rights movement for deaf individuals, what we call the deaf civil rights movement in the United States of America and also in Maine. And that includes a lot of different events, including Deaf President Now, which I'll get into a little bit later as I go through some of the history. All right, here we go. If we look back at the early history and foundations of the deaf civil rights movement, we can mark 1880 as the beginning of the National Association of the Deaf. So that was a time when deaf leaders organized to defend their rights by starting what we call NAD, the National Association of the Deaf. It was founded in that year. And that organization wanted to advocate for American Sign Language. It wanted to advocate for the education of deaf children, for equal rights, and for deaf teachers to be recruited to do that educating. Also for things like captioning, once there was television that was widely available to folks, and other types of access for the deaf community. And really, in parallel to what Kim said, to show that deaf people belong, that we had a place at the table. And throughout the 20th century, deaf advocates fought for these many things. And then as the 20th century was progressing, those advocacy efforts started to just deal with those different areas of life. For example, growing interpreter services. And in the 1980s, certainly that also started to see a time when deaf folks who were Black, deaf folks of color, deaf folks as members of the LGBTQTA community started to push for equal rights as well. And we became stronger as we began to fight and collaborate with different factions of our community. Deaf President Now took place in 1988. I'll give you a little bit of historical perspective. Gallaudet University was looking for a new president of the university. There were two deaf applicants, a hard of hearing applicant, and the Gallaudet board looked at the applicants and chose the individual who was a hearing woman. Many Gallaudet students were watching intently this process of interviewing and selecting the new president. Keep in mind that the woman that was selected to be the new president was not even familiar with American Sign Language, was not a member of the community, was not versed in any of the needs of the community. There was a huge protest that the students led. There were four demands that the students put forward. One was to make sure that that current person would be replaced by a deaf applicant. Also, that the board membership would have a majority representation of deaf people. That the protesters would not be punished. And that protest went on for 8 days. The students, faculty, and other community members staged a sit-in. They took control of parts of the campus. They shut down the campus and had marches and got a lot of national attention as well. And then finally, I. King Jordan was selected. The applicant who was not well versed in American Sign Language, that individual, that woman stepped down, and I. King Jordan was selected. And the students had their demands met. So the deaf civil rights movement really, through this Deaf President Now moment, gained so much attention because this was not just a local protest happening in Washington, D.C., but there was a lot of media attention, and it had a huge impact on a new generation of leaders, of activists, and we are still seeing those deaf activists, politicians. We're still reaping what those students sowed during those protests and during that 8 days, looking for equal rights, looking for a place at the table, and to say, we also belong. And so much of what Kim was talking about, we can see that those inspirational movements were also expressed and conveyed through the deaf community to fight for equal access, equal rights, equity through activism, through collaboration, and that is an ongoing effort as well. When we focus on Maine, the Maine Association of the Deaf was also established in the 1800s, and it continues to be a very vital and rich organization fighting for equity, providing services for the community of deaf folks in Maine. We also have our Maine Educational Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, originally called the Governor Baxter School for the Deaf. And a lot of the work that is being done by these organizations and centers continues fighting for that equity. And when we look at the Governor Baxter School for the Deaf, it's now called the Maine Educational Center for Deaf and Hard of Hearing, as I mentioned. And they continue to be working with deaf students on a statewide basis. They continue to bring in deaf educators. So the work is ongoing. We continue to do that advocacy work in a broad way and within different organizations. And we also have the Maine Civil Rights Division here within Disability Rights Maine. Our civil rights work continues within this organization, focusing on advocacy and the legal needs of deaf members of our main community, making sure that access is happening, making sure that people are not facing illegal barriers. We also have a state agency, the Division for the Deaf, Hard of Hearing, and Late Deafened, that keeps a roster of interpreters who are licensed, certified, and qualified to work in Maine. They also host our annual awards tea in Augusta, recognizing important people in our community, people who continue to do this work. And during that week of our awards tea, there is also a week of a variety of events celebrating our deaf culture, our language, and our community. We have so many pieces of this story and so many intersections with the larger disability rights movement. We continue to fight the good fight. We continue to fight for equity and access. And I am personally pleased to see so many advances when it comes to things that are provided in the community, interpreting services, interpreting for meetings, for public meetings, for town forums, for concerts, captioned movies, interpreting better services in hospital and medical settings. As a deaf community, the Maine Association of the Deaf, Disability Rights Maine, the Maine Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, which is now a part of the Maine Association of the Deaf, Recreational, Maine Recreation for Deaf Folks, and also our Tri-Flying Hands. We are all working together. So thank you all very much for your time and for listening. Thank you.